Sword Brothers by Giles Kristian. Read by Philip Stevens. In the storm of swords, when the Valkyries fly, when the blood tide flows and the chosen die, and the shield din rolls across the sky, and corpses in the wound sea lie, when the wolves come to feast and the crows rasp with glee, will you be my brother? Will you stand with me? In the clash of iron, when the arrows soar free, will you stand as true as the hanging tree? For cattle die, and kinsmen too, but fame is made in the hack and hew, in the song of spears, the slaughter's due. Will you stand with me? I will stand with you. She was called Sea Wanderer, and she was a beauty. 70 feet long, 16 in the beam, the finest oak, fashioned by the most skilled hands. 15 pairs of oars, her mast over 30 feet tall. And she was well named, too, for she had, in the days of Jarl Gripr, sailed north up the Hålogaland, and south as far as Ribbe. She had rolled along the Danemen's ragged coast like thunder, returning to Bora waddling like a woman heavy with child, for all the silver and slaves in her. Now she wanders the swaying reed beds of Ran's kingdom with the drowned, though that is a story for another day. We were sweating at the oars, had them beating like eagle's wings across the fjord. Lord knows there was wind enough for the sail, but Jarl Gripr wanted to show our enemies how good we were at the benches, how there was not a mouse's tail between each man's oar blade biting the water, how we bent and pulled to swan. And nor did we mind, for a warrior would sooner be busy before a fight than sitting there watching the coast, his belly writhing like a serpent, wondering if the Norns were readying their shears to cut his life's thread. We were singing, badly and loud, some old tune about a flaxen-haired beauty with breasts like cream in the pail, a song we had not the stones to sing back home in earshot of our wives, and we knew our voices carried across the water. All to the good, because maybe Jarl Oddbjorn and his headmen would hear us and know we cared nothing for stealth this day. Stealth? Ha! We were no fox creeping to the henhouse. The day was clear and bright, and our spear blades and helmets, shield bosses and mail tunics were newly polished, and must have glinted like Odin's one eye when mischief is in him. And the gulls followed in our wake, a score of them wheeling and plunging, keening with the same mad joy that was in us. That wild joy. Sea Wanderer was newly caulked, her timbers and ropes sticky with pine tar and sweet-smelling, her sheer strake painted red and yellow up to the soaring arches of stern and prow, where her beast tail curled, and her head snarled at the approaching shore. Our shields were mounted in the rack. The sun shone above, so that the fjord glistened in the dawn like molten bronze, and our oar blades bit with such ravenous hunger that the water frothed white before the bow. It was a golden day, a Freya day, and we were going to make a slaughter. "Are they pouring the mead in welcome?" Randa called to Sigurd at the tiller, for we all had our backs to the shore, but for our steersman and Gripr himself, who stood at the prow, watching for hidden rocks, lest we rip open Sea Wanderer's belly and die drowning with our enemy's laughter in our ears. "Not just mead!" Sigurd cried back, stretching his neck to better see what awaited us. "I think I see tables and benches on the shingle. They're waving their horns, for they mean to welcome us with a rare feast." "I smell that swine roasting," Havalda called, leaning back in the stroke, the sweat gleaming on his brow and dripping from his beard. "All I can smell is sheerack and mackerel, and it had best not be Jarl Oddbjorn's bedrolls." Rowthy nod, hawking up a green gobbet and spitting it into the greasy, brine-slick thwarts. We laughed at that, though in truth too loudly for it to be wholly honest. We knew what we were going to, and it was no feast. Well, a feast for the crows, perhaps. "A little further!" Gripr shouted from the prow. "Put your backs into it, you lazy wretches! The stroke is getting feeble. Your mothers could row faster. Don't you shame me in front of these horse-uns!" We grimaced and bent to the oars, though we knew our stroke had not faltered since we had rounded the tip of Skumroy, with its thrashing surf, and came under the gaze of any Skjervik folk who might be looking out across the fjord. We sweated and pulled, the muscles in our arms and backs bunching and swollen, my forearms aching, because I have always gripped the oar a little too tightly, and we pulled Sea Wanderer through the water, driving her on to whatever the Norns had spun for us. 10 strokes more! Jarl Gripr called. I looked over my shoulder and saw him at the prow, his mail iron grim in the shade of a new cloak of vivid blue that must have had him sweating on such a day, even though he was not rowing as we were. That fine cloak was fastened with a silver brooch that flashed the sun into my eye, so that I had to blink and look away. 6 more! He called out. No singing now, no laughing. We all knew what we were going to. I looked across at Rowthy and saw that he was already lost to us. His eyes were no longer his own, and spittle foamed at his lips and hung in his beard. I could hear the low growl rumbling in his chest as he rowed. "On my word!" Gripr yelled. We worked the oars as well as we ever had, as though the gods themselves were watching. And perhaps they were. Reach, bite, drive, finish. "For Odin!" Steinarr roared. "For Odin!" we bellowed as one in reply. Reach, bite, drive, finish. I summoned my father's face, and thought of his father, and all those of my line now feasting in Valhall, waiting for me. Drive. Finish. "Now!" called Gripr. I and half the crew pulled in our oars, stacked them in the oar tree, put on our helmets, fetched up spears and axes, and stood looking at the shore, while the remaining warriors made the last big strokes needed to drive Sea Wanderer up the shingle. I saw the men of Skjervik then, waiting for us in their shield wall above the tide line. No more than a score of them. Jarl Oddbjorn himself at their center, his mail glinting in the noon sun, his eyes unseen in the shadow of his burnished helmet. They stood there well enough, those men, though they must have seen their deaths coming on that flood tide. And now, Steinarr, in all his war glory, his own brynja polished to a lustrous sheen, his crow-black hair spilling from his fine helmet, and his long axe gripped by its throat, strode the length of the ship, to take his place of honor at the prow. Men gnawed words of blood as he passed them, gave him the respect he was owed. Steinarr, our greatest warrior, and Jarl Gripr's prowman, the one to strike fear into our enemies' bellies, the first into the fight, the first to reap men's lives. Even Gripr took some paces back to make way for him, the two exchanging wolves' grins as Steinarr stepped up at the bow so that the Skjervik men could see him well, and placed a hand against the prow beast as though invoking its fierce spirit. I saw Ormgeir put his Thor's hammer to his lips and whisper something. I saw Svati say something to his spear blade, perhaps some promise that it would soon drink its fill. Saw Halgeir make a fist and strike his helmet 3 times, as he always did before a fight. And his brother, Havaldr, muttering to Tyr the most brave, whilst pulling a comb through his long beard, like a man going to a mead hall full of beauties rather than a battle. I felt the strange tremble then, in the big muscles of my legs and in my belly, a feeling of moths beating their wings in my flesh, and I knew it for what it was, a little fear, but mostly the battle spirit seeping through me, building like water to the boil, the beginnings of the blood madness. The last rowers shipped their oars and grabbed their war gear as I gripped the shearstrake and Sea Wanderer made landfall, grinding up the shingle and lurching to a stop. And I saw Jarl Oddbjorn's shield wall open up and a warrior step forward, his bare chest cross-hatched with old scars, his hair and beard matted and dirty, and his eyes wild like Rauthi's. No mail, helmet, or shield, just a pair of short axes, and not an ounce of fear. Not an ounce of anything in that thought cage of his, judging by the way he turned his face up and howled at the midday sky. Then he lowered his head and seemed to fasten his eyes to Steinarr for 3 heartbeats before breaking into a loping run. Steinarr did not wait another moment, but swung himself over Sea Wanderer's side, landing on the shingle with a grunt for the weight of his war gear, his long axe gripped across his body. I and 6 others already had hands on the shearstrake, ready to leap over the side behind Steinarr, but Gripr raised a fist. "Wait," he said. So I straightened and watched the berserker running at Steinarr like a feral beast. Steinarr had time to loop his great axe once through the warm air, its steel-edged blade sharp enough to cut a draugr. Then the berserker was on him, leaping at the last moment, yet somehow ducking too, avoiding Steinarr's axe blade as it scythed upward. And even as he flew, the berserker swung his left hand back, his short axe biting into the mail at Steinarr's left shoulder to send a few iron rings flying like fish scales. We heard the cheer from Oddbjorn's warriors a little further up the beach, as their man landed in the surf on all 4s like some animal, and turned, teeth bared, eyes round. Then he straightened, so that we who were watching could see the rune scars on his skin and read in them the stories of his many victories. Perhaps Oddbjorn's men saw the tale of Steinarr's ill weird in those iron-etched scars, because they had set this mad beast loose before, and raised ale horns with him when the rage had drained away, and the men he had faced lay sightless on the earth, to be picked at by crows. But all Steinarr did was smile, then beckoned the berserker with a twitch of his long axe. Oddbjorn's man howled again, the surf foaming at his knees like the spittle at his mouth. Then he ran at Steinarr, who ran at him, swinging that great axe and stepping out to his right to give the haft its full length, the wicked sharp blade taking the berserker above the line of his trews and opening him up like a codfish. He fell face down onto the slick stones and jerked there for 3 heartbeats, then went still. But for his gut rope, which slithered slowly out of him like some purple serpent seeking to leave his corpse. The next swell of the sea came in clear, but went out red. It was our turn to cheer then, as we sprung over Sea Wanderer's side like the young men we were, and yelled our insults at the Skjervik men. Normally, we would have made the Skjaldborg, and trudged up the strand, shoulder to shoulder, shield rims overlapping, beating the lime wood with sword hilts or spear staves. But we had just seen our prowman near cut a man in half, and we knew that that was one for the skulls. It had on us the effect of strong ale, for instead of building the rampart of shields, we ran. If Steinarr was first into the fray, Gripr was only a breath behind him, thrusting his spear into the eye of a Skjervik man who had thought their shield wall would hold. But it could not, because Steinarr had brought his long axe down to cleave a shield with such force that the man behind it buckled and fell on his arse, and I swung my own smiting axe to break another shield, taking an arm with it, widening that breach and spelling Jarl Oddbjorn's doom. For into that breach went Rowthy Crow Fever, screeching like a fox caught in a trap, hacking with his short axe and slashing with his sax. After Skjervik, Ulfkettel said he had not seen men shit their truce like those shield wall men since he was a boy, and he had found a wasp nest in the woodpile. Carefully, little Ulfkettel had removed the nest, carried it to the smokehouse where his mother's new husband and his friends were hanging meat, opened the door, and thrown the buzzing thing inside before barring the door behind him. Back in Border, we had laughed at Ulfkettel's story, but there was no laughing in Skjervik as Rowthy frenzied, slicing and stabbing any flesh within reach, so that the rest of us kept our distance, killing our own enemies where we could. A big warrior with a beard like an eagle's nest, and a nose at least one warrior had flattened for him in skirmishes past, grabbed the haft of my long axe and began wrenching it from my grasp. I stepped in to shorten the distance between us, and smashed my helmet into his nose. It seemed the man had not learned that lesson well enough. Yet still he held on, blood gushing over his snarling mouth into that fucked beard of his. He was strong as Thor, I'll give him that, and I knew my axe would be his axe soon enough. But I was not about to be butchered with my own blade, and so I suddenly let go. The big man stumbled backward, even as I drew my sax and took one stride and sheathed it in the left side of his neck. The blade passed right through, enough of it sticking out the other side to hang a helmet on. He stared at me for an uncomfortably long moment, then fell to his knees before Svarti slammed his shield into him, clearing him from my path. It was a slaughter. Randa was down, a spear having opened his belly, and I saw Ormgeir take a sword in the thigh and die on a flood tide of his own blood in the time it takes to tell it. But other than that, it seemed we were Odin blessed, for it was fast and brutal, a bloodletting for the skulls. We had turned that golden day red. A feast for crows, hey on? Steinarr growled, swinging his axe, gore flying from the blade. I did not reply, too busy turning this way and that in the reeking press of bodies, watching out for the snaking spear or some unseen sword thrust. But the Skjervik men's shield wall was a wreck of shattered limewood and opened flesh and corpses. Varði and Ulfkettel had taken hold of one man by his arms, while Havalda plunged his spear into the man's belly. Ingvar, Sigvaldi, and Gubi were already on their knees, picking amongst the dead like magpies for anything shiny. I had retrieved my axe from Flatnose and turned to see a blood-slathered, red-haired warrior climb to his feet, sword in hand, and hack at Sigurd, who had his back to the man. Sigurd stumbled forward, growling some filthy curse, and I swung at the Skjervik man, using the pole to smash in his skull rather than risk the blade snagging in his iron helmet. Gripr himself put Oddbjorn down, though I didn't see it. I did see another Skjervik man rise from the dead, though. A young man, thin as a polecat, jumped up from the meat pile and flew at Gripr. And for a heartbeat, I feared he had stuck a knife in our Jarl, for Gripr barked in surprise and made a grab for him. Yet he may as well have tried to catch a fart, because the lad was lightning, and it was no blade that I saw in his right hand as he flew, leaping over the dead and dying and herring up the beach towards the rise, beyond which the smoke from his village hung like a brown smudge against the blue sky. "Little shit!" Gripr snarled, watching the lad go. "Took my brooch! Look there!" Svati called out, pointing his spear out to sea. We all saw it then. A dragon ship. Its red sail billowed, bow drooling, beast head prow nodding as it came. "Gripr, this isn't Oddbjorn," Gubi said, crouched beside the man Gripr had killed, holding up the man's helmet, which was so fine that we had all took it to mean it was Jarl Oddbjorn inside it. "His brother, I think. Ivar." "Yes, that's Ivar," I said, getting my first proper look at the corpse, for I had once hunted elk with the man. "And that is Fjordleaper, all right?" Svati said, watching the oncoming ship. It had now turned its bow a little to the north, to beach a far arrow shot further up the coast. So protective of his ship was Oddbjorn. And there was the Jarl himself, standing at the prow, watching us. "Well, that explains why there were so few here to greet us," Ulfkettel said, bending to pull his gore-slick sword through a dead man's cloak. "Best take what we can and go," Rowthy said, examining a sax he had found amongst the dead. "Aye, no thralls for us today. That little streak of piss," Steinarr nodded, and I realized he and Jarl Gripr were not looking at the ship full of men coming to kill us, but rather had their gaze fixed on the lone, slight figure now standing on the rise overlooking the shingle. "Ragnhildur is going to skin me alive," Gripr said. "She gave me the thing not 2 moons ago, bought it from a trader who had picked it up in Kaupang." I saw that he was holding his fine new blue cloak in one hand, unfastened, without that pretty silver brooch, now in the hand of the Skjervik lad atop the rise. Worse still, the skinny little shit was holding it aloft for Gripr to see. He stood there waving that brooch like the cocky, thieving, should-have-been-dead little weasel that he was. Like he'd crawled up Odin's own arsehole and stole the best cut of meat from the Lord of Raven's guts, and somehow lived to tell of it. "Slippery fuck," Steinarr growled. "Back to the ship," Gripr called, turning away.
I don't like the way this day is shaping,
Halgir said, for he was always one to see the Norns coming with the shears in their hands. We had lost 3 men now, for Sigurd had died of that sword wound, and at least 3 more had taken wounds that might end them yet. Not without the brooch, Steinarr said. If any other man had said it, we might have thought it a joke. But Steinarr was still looking up at that little thief, and his face had all the joking in it of a cliff face on a winter's day. If we don't go now, we'll have to fight Oddbjorn and his whole crew, Gripr said.
Too many for us,
Havalda put in, pulling his long golden beard through a hand as he eyed Fjordleaper. The ship was now just 3 or 4 good arrow flights from the shore, her crew lowering the sail and getting ready to avenge their fallen kinfolk. You'd rather face Ragnhilde? Steinarr asked Gripr. And now there was a glint of something like Loki mischief in Steinarr's eye. I would rather face Fenrir, Gripr said, the corner of his lips warping slightly, his eyes blue and wild-looking in his blood-spattered face. Gripr looked over at me. "On," he said. He did not need to uncoil the whole of it. I knew what he was asking, and so I growled a curse and nodded. A weasel ass like that shouldn't have such a fine brooch, I admitted, taking off my helmet, as Gripr and Steinarr had, even if he owned a good wool cloak to fasten with it. Gripr turned to the rest of the men. "Back to the ship, all of you!" He tossed his helmet to Vadi, who caught it. I gave mine to Svati. "Make ready to row against the tide!" For a moment, they stood there, staring, not liking that at all. "Do what I say, and you will each earn an arm ring," Gripr told them. "We'll be back here before Oddbjorn gets his shoes wet." There were some grumbles at that, but they would do what their Jarl told them, and not a man amongst them would forget the promise of the arm ring. If Gripr didn't get himself killed, that was. Steinarr grinned at me, and I cursed again and hefted my axe. Then we ran. I don't think the skinny thief believed his eyes, for he stood there a long moment, watching us, no longer waving Gripr's brooch like some spoils robbed from Fafnir's own hoard, but watching the 3 men in war gear loping up the beach toward him, even as his Jarl and a shipload of warriors were but a hero's spear throw from the shore further up the coast. It was a warm day, as I have said, and I was glad I had left my helmet. Still, no man likes to run in a brynja, and I was puffing like the forge bellows, my mouth dry as Draugr's piss by the time we crested that rise and looked upon Skjevik and Jarl Oddbjorn's longhole. "There he is," Steinarr said, breathing hard and pointing over towards a grain barn. I caught a glimpse of the thief as he slipped inside, no doubt thinking he had vanished before we had come over the rise. There was no sign of any other Skjevik folk. Black smoke curled up from the forge and from the longhouse itself, but Oddbjorn's people had taken their silver and run for the woods, as Oddbjorn's brother, Ivar, had led what warriors he had out to meet us. In truth, I did not think we could get to that barn, find the lad, take back the brooch, and then return safely to Sea Wanderer before Jarl Oddbjorn reached us. I was a little older than Gripr, who was a little older than Steinarr, and I had rowed and fought already that day, and now I had run up a hill in mail. And yet, it was a fine brooch that Ragnhilde had gifted our Jarl, a ring which some skilled silversmith had crafted to resemble the Midgard serpent Jormungand, eternally biting at its own tail. Its pin long and slender and sharp as a woman's tongue. And like fools, we were still young enough to believe it would be a long time yet before we tasted the Allfather's golden mead.
Shame to come all this way and not take something of Oddbjorn's,
Gripr said, his eyes roving across the meadow to take in the long hall as we ran towards the barn. It was larger than Gripr's, that hall, but I didn't say it. We'll come back for his high seat and mead benches before summer's end, I said. I meant it as a joke, but I knew Gripr thought it a fine idea. We passed a pig pen and scattered a handful of hens, then slowed and looked to our wits lest we find ourselves facing any Skjevik folk brandishing hammers, chisels, pliers, or piss-pots. But it was as we had thought. The place was empty, but for the animals and one old greybeard who sat on a stool beside his workbench in the sunshine, squinting at us. Too old to run with the rest, perhaps, or else the old man had nothing left to fear in this life. I nodded to him in greeting, and he nodded back. Then Gripr and I approached the barn, while Steinarr skirted the outside to look for another way in. Gripr was about to open the barn door when I took hold of his shoulder. If you get run through by some thieving string of dog vomit with a sharp stick, I don't have the silver to find a skald good enough to weave a hero saga of it. He nodded. I went first. Any stealth we might have had was shat on by the creaking hinges, so I squared my shoulders in the gloom of that place and lifted the long axe, pointing it at the dark piles of straw and grain, tools and barrels. There was no sign of the lad. "Give us the brooch, lad," I said to the shadows.
Do it now, or we'll bar the door and set fire to these nice dry timbers,
Gripr beside me said. Something skittered across the ground nearby. Just a rat. Nothing else stirred. Perhaps the lad had seen his Jarl's ship returning and thought he could wait us out. If so, he had more clever in him than I would have said from the look of him. "If I have to ask again, I'll take your hands back to Bora to feed my favorite pig," I said, "leaving you to wipe your ass with weeping stumps the rest of your days." Still nothing. "We're running out of time," I growled under my breath. Gripr cursed. Then I had an idea. Suddenly I took a step forward. "There you are!" I bellowed, though of course I had no clue where he was. He shot out from behind some barrels and fled toward the back of the barn. He pulled open a small door and was gone, so we plunged after him. And I blinked in the sudden sunlight, seeing the slick-as-troll snot little shit squirming against Steinarr's Gleipnir-like grasp. Steinarr had already relieved him of the brooch, which he tossed to Gripr, who caught it, grinning. Then Steinarr drew his sacks. "Keep still, or this will take longer," he told the lad. "Let him go, Steinarr," Gripr said. "The lad survived that slaughter down there, so I'm thinking it's not his weird to die this day." Steinarr shrugged, then flung the lad aside like a gnawed bone, which was when we heard yelling and the rhythmic thunder of iron against shields. My heart was hammering, and I was soaked through with eye-stinging sweat when we came again to the high ground overlooking the shingled beach. There was Sea Wanderer, back in the surf now, though half her crew were standing on the beach with ropes, keeping her bow to the shore while the stone anchor held her stern in place against the currents. The other half were at the benches, oars ready to drive her out, their eyes no doubt searching the high ground for us. Their shouts carried to us, on the same breeze that brought the shield thunder from Oddbjorn's men, who were striding down the strand in a loose shield wall, working themselves up for the blood fray. "This is going to be close as arse cheeks," I said, looking at the ground we would have to cross before Jarl Oddbjorn's warband cut us off from Sea Wanderer. Gripr, though, somehow found the time to close his eyes and turn his face up to the sky. He breathed in deeply. Crimson glistened on his cheeks and beard. "Feel that?" he said. "The change in the breeze." I felt nothing but the fear of my flesh being sliced, my bones hacked, my guts spilled. "That gust is the Valkyries swooping near," Gripr went on. "They come to choose the slain." "Then let them choose someone else," I said, looking to Steinarr for his agreement, though he was just glaring at Jarl Oddbjorn's men as though already composing his own saga tale. "So, what are you waiting for, Arn?" Gripr asked, and with that, he broke into a run. We ran after him. We flew. Like wolves we raced across that rough ground, grey and male, the iron rings jingling, and now and then stumbling amongst tufts of long grass. "It is a fine brooch, eh?" Gripr called out. "As fine as any I ever saw," Steinarr managed through halting breaths, sweat flying from his black beard. And now Oddbjorn's men were running too. The Jarl knew it was a foot race, and that should he win, his prize would be Gripr's sword-famed prowman and the Jarl of Bora himself. And that would be a tale for his people to tell around the hearth on dark winter nights, when stories are the only escape from the cold gloom. We were not going to make it. I could see Svati and Vigi, Sigvaldi and Gubi, letting go of the ropes and taking up their war gear again, having decided that they would go to Valhall with us. Others aboard Sea Wanderer were on their feet, yelling at us to run faster, hurling insults at us for being so slow. I had never run faster, not since I was old enough to stand in the shield wall. But it was not fast enough. The quickest of Oddbjorn's men had separated from the pack, barely a spear throw from our own men. Others were slanting across the rising ground to block us, knowing they would get to us before we could get to Svati and the rest. It would be a bad death, for I was spent. Yes, my legs still ran, as if of their own will, but I would have little axe strength left, so that it would make a poor end, one which men would mutter into their ale cups as they drank, rather than speak aloud. And yet, Gripr was laughing as he ran. Steinarr too, and perhaps I laughed too, though I had not the breath in my body for it. How the gods love chaos, and that day was drenched in it. One of Oddbjorn's men hurled his spear, which clattered onto the shingle in front of me, so that I leapt it in pure joy and ran on. And now I could see grins on faces I knew. 20 paces. I could smell Oddbjorn's men on the air, the pine tar on their clothes, the sweat-soaked wool, the foul breath which carried their insults and curses. Another spear flew, passing close enough that I felt the wind of it on my face. 10 paces. "Don't stop!" Gripr called. Perhaps he thought we might try to fight. I did not stop. They were on us. One of Oddbjorn's men lurched with a spear, the blade sliding off my brynja, but I did not break stride. And then we were past, splashing into the sea behind Svati and Vigi, Sigvaldi and Gubi. hurling our weapons over the side and reaching up so that our oar-mates could haul us aboard like some strange catch. "Row!" Avalda roared. "Row, you sons of Odin!" And they rowed, as we three sat slumped against the hull, gasping like fish in the thwarts. Some spears came over after us, and some stones. Plenty of insults, too, which were repaid in full by those working Sea Wanderer's oars. I looked at Gripr, who sat there, round-eyed, dazed, as though he had taken a blow to the head, though grinning still. I looked across at Steinarr, who was lying against the strakes across from me. "This is life, Heian!" he yelled. "This is life!" I looked back at Gripr, who was clutching that brooch which Ragnhilda had given him. A thing of silver, glinting on a day of gold.
We hope you have enjoyed this audio production of Sword Brothers, written by Giles Kristian and read by Philip Stevens. This was a World Serpent audio production, recorded at White House Sound. Text copyright Giles Kristian 2025. The moral right of the author has been asserted. All rights reserved. For more information, please visit www.gileskristian.com. Thanks for listening.